I grew up in a place called Repulse Bay. And Repulse Bay is right up at the very north end of Hudson Bay, right on the Arctic Circle. And when I was a little boy, early in the morning, my father would get up, he would go outside, he would look at the weather, and then he would take our sled and he would turn it over on its back. We used these huge sleds with 2 runners and cross pieces that are all tied together. And before we had plastic runners on our sleds, we used to have frozen mud all along the bottoms of our sled runners. So my father would take the sled, he would turn it over, he would take a piece of polar bear skin and a kettle of water. He would pour the water on the polar bear skin and he would rub it along the bottoms of the sled runners. He would let the water freeze, so we ended up with this nice layer of ice all along the bottoms of our sled runners. And that's what we traveled on. And when my father was all finished icing the sled, he would roll it back up. We would take all our stuff out from inside our igloo. We would put them on the sled, we would roll them up in huge skins and tie them all down. And then we would hitch our dogs to our sled and we would go traveling all day long. Well, where we come from, there are no trees. There is not one single tree that grows where we come from. And because we have no trees to get in the way, we hitch our dogs all on separate lines. So every dog has his very own line. We might have 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 dogs. They all have their own lines. The dogs that like to run get the longest lines, and the lazy ones get the short ones. And when we were going along, the dogs would jump over each other over and over and over and over until their lines were so tangled up that they couldn't run anymore. We would stop. My father would take all the lines off the dogs. He would untangle them all. My mother would make us lunch, and after lunch we'd go traveling all the rest of the day. And you know, sometimes you get just a little cool. The coldest day I remember in Rankin Inlet was 52 below Celsius, which works out to 61 below Fahrenheit. And it was before we started measuring temperature with wind chill. And it was really windy that day. So with the wind chill, it was probably somewhere closer to 75 or 80 below. And if you're going to be outside all day long, you have to wear some really warm clothes. And we wore the warmest clothing in the world. I had a caribou skin coat, which was like a sweatshirt with a hood, and it had fur on the inside, so I had caribou fur right up against my skin. On top of that, I had another caribou skin coat, and it had the fur on the outside. And even then, when I was sitting on a sled for a long time, I would start to get cold. And when I got cold, I would jump off the sled, I would run along beside the sled until I got all warmed up, then I would sit back down again. And sometimes I didn't even have to jump off because we would hit a bump and I would fall off. And then I'd have to run to catch up. So we traveled like that all day long, and at night when we stopped, my father would build an igloo. When the igloo was all ready, we'd go inside, we'd bring all our stuff inside. My mother and my grandmother would light a big stone seal oil lamp called a kudlik. They would start to cook us something to eat. They would heat up the inside of the igloo a little bit because sometimes it was really quite cold. And then they would make up a bed, a nice big bed with lots of warm furs. And every night after I finished eating, I'd go to bed. And when I went to bed, I would say to my grandmother, and she would say, Unikaktuag sa kangin nama. Grandmother, please tell me a story. But I have no story to tell. Grandmother, please tell me a story. But I have no story to tell. And after I asked her many times, she would finally say, okay, settle down and I'll tell you a story. And my grandmother told me some of the most wonderful stories I have ever heard. My most favorite story in the whole world was the one that goes like this. You like that story? It's a story about a little girl and her grandmother. And they get left behind all by themselves in their igloo. And then a little bird came and it broke the window. And it said, "Palatatat," and flew away. And that was the story. And I really loved that story, and I would ask my grandmother to tell it to me over and over and over again until she got tired. It was like a little nursery rhyme, you know, until she got tired of it, and then she wouldn't want to tell it to me anymore. So I would ask her again, and she would say, Grandmother, please tell me another story. But I have no story to tell. But of course, my grandmother always had lots and lots of stories to tell. Well, the most famous person in our stories is a man called Kivio. My grandmother said Kivio was born a long time ago. So long ago that he was the very first person on Earth. And I used to have this little argument with my grandmother. I said, Grandmother, if Kivio was the first person on Earth, how come he had a mother? And she said, don't argue with old people. I said, okay. Well, anyway, my grandmother also said Kivio is still alive today. But he is so old, his body is turning to stone. And someday when his heart turns completely to stone and stops, that will be the end of the world. And there are many stories about this man. Well, a long time ago, there was a little boy, and this little boy loved to go out to play. But there were mean boys who lived in this camp. They would run after him, they would fight him, they would make him cry, they would rip up all his clothes. And the poor boy would go home to his grandmother because he was an orphan. He had no mother and no father, so he lived with his grandmother. And his poor old grandmother would take her needle and thread, and she would sew his clothes all back together again. And the little boy would put on his clothes, he would go off to play. The mean boys would run after him, they would fight him, they would make him cry, and they would rip up all his clothes. And this happened every day. And one day, his grandmother got so tired of sewing his clothes back together. One day, when the little boy came home, there was a little seal that somebody had caught for them, and it was lying on the floor. And his grandmother said, I would like you to skin that seal. So the little boy took a knife, and he started to skin the seal. And his grandmother said, be careful, don't put any holes in the skin. So very carefully, the little boy skinned the seal. And when he was all finished, that's my cell phone. So no, just ignore it, it'll quit. You know who that might be though? The Norwegian embassy. They think I'm going to answer it though. Anyway, yeah, I'm going to go have dinner with the Norwegian ambassador on Thursday. So anyway, so the little boy skinned the seal, and when he was all finished, his grandmother said, I would like you to take the seal skin and pull it over your head, and I would like you to put your head in that pail of water. There was a great big pail of water on the floor, so the little boy took a knife, or he put the seal skin over his head so that it fit nicely, and he looked like a little seal. And then he took a deep breath, and he stuck his head in this pail of water. And he kept his head underwater as long as he could. And when his lungs hurt, he lifted up his head and he went, and his grandmother said, do it again. So he took another deep breath, and he stuck his head back in this pail of water. And he kept his head underwater as long as he could. And when his lungs were just about to break, he lifted up his head and he went, and his grandmother said, do it again. So he took another deep breath, and he stuck his head back in this pail of water. And he kept his head underwater as long as he could, going like this. And when he was just about to drown, he lifted up his head and he went, and his grandmother said, do it again. Every time he lifted up his head, his grandmother would say, do it again. He would take a deep breath and he would stick his head back in this pail of water. And after a while, he could keep his head underwater for a long time. Because after a while, when he had his head underwater, the sun would move. And finally, his grandmother was satisfied that he could keep his head underwater long enough. And she said, I would like you to go down to the beach. And when you're walking to the beach, make sure nobody sees you. And when you get to the water's edge, I would like you to take the sealskin and pull it over your head, jump into the water and go for a swim, and come up right in front of all your mean friends who are playing on the beach. And sure enough, all the mean boys were playing on the beach. So the little boy took the sealskin, he walked down to the beach, he made sure nobody saw him, and when he got to the water's edge, he took the sealskin, he pulled it over his head so that it fit nicely, and he looked like a little seal. And then he took a deep breath, and he jumped into the water, and he went for a swim underwater. And he came up right in front of all the mean boys who were playing on the beach. And they looked at him, and they said, hey, there's a little seal. They thought he was the little seal. And they all ran up. They grabbed their kayaks, you know, their long skinny skin boats. They put their kayaks in the water. They hopped in. They took their long paddles, and they started paddling, following the little seal. And the little seal would go down underwater, and he would swim a little bit farther out, and then he would come up again. And then he would go down, and he would swim a little bit farther out, and then he would come up again. And the mean boys who fought him and made him cry and ripped all his clothes, they were paddling their kayaks, following along behind him. And it was a beautiful, beautiful day. And after a while, they were way out at sea. And when they were way out at sea, when the little seal came up, he would lift up his arm and his leg, and he would sing, Ano kaya na, ano kaya kaili, unga, unga. And then he'd go down again. And he would swim a little bit farther out, and when he came up, he would lift up his arm and his leg, and he would sing, Ano kaya na, ano kaya kaili, unga, unga. And then he'd go down again. And he would swim a little bit farther out, and when he came up, he would lift up his arm and his leg, and he would sing, Where is my wind? I want my wind. And he'd make a crying sound like a little baby. Wah, wah. People say the weather that was on the day you were born is your very own weather. And that is why, if you were born on a sunny day, usually the sun shines on your birthday. If you were born on a rainy day, usually it rains on your birthday. And this little boy was born on a very, very windy day. And he was calling the weather that was on the day he was born. Where is my wind? I want my wind. And he made a crying sound like a little baby. Wah, wah. The wind heard him, and it started to come. And it got windier and windier and windier. And before long, there were huge waves in the water. And the kayaks with all the mean boys were going up and down in the big waves. And every now and then a giant wave would come and it would flip the kayaks over. And the mean boys who fought him and made him cry and ripped all his clothes, they were sinking to the bottom of the sea. And after a while, there was only one person left. That person was Kivio. Now, Kivio was really, really good with his paddle, and he paddled his kayak on and on, going up and down in the big waves. And when a giant wave came and flipped his kayak over, he would roll it back up using his paddle. And he kept on going. No matter how cold and wet and tired he got, he never gave up. And finally, after a long time, the wind stopped. And the sea became really, really still again. And Kivio was so tired, he put his paddle on his lap, he put his head on his chest, and he fell asleep. He slept for a long time. When he woke up, he sat up in his kayak. He looked around, he looked all around, but there was nothing but water. He was way out in the middle of the ocean. And because he was way out in the middle of the ocean, he couldn't see any land anywhere. And because he couldn't see any land anywhere, he didn't know which way to go. And while he was sitting there, he started to think about some strange and wonderful things. One of the things he thought about was this little feather he had on the back of his coat. You see, ever since he was a tiny little boy, his mother, see, I told you he had a mother. His mother always sewed this little feather on the back of his coat. It was a feather from a little bird called a saugak. And a saugak is a little brown bird that swims in tiny ponds, and while it's swimming, it goes around in circles, all around and round and round. And while it's going around in circles, it goes like this. They're funny little birds, and I love to watch them. And he had this little feather on the back of his coat, and he always wondered what it was for. And while he was sitting there, a little bird came. The little bird landed on his kayak. It looked at Kiviok and said, "Do you know which way to go?" And Kiviok said, "No, I don't know which way to go because there's nothing but water." And the little bird said, "Well, follow me." So we start to follow the little bird. And he paddled his kayak on and on. After a long time, he saw this really thin line on the horizon like a little piece of thread. And he thought it was land, so he paddled his kayak toward it. But after a while, it disappeared, and the little bird looked at him again and said, "Do you know which way to go?" And Kiviok said, "No, I don't know which way to go because there's nothing but water." And the little bird said, "Well, follow me." So we start to follow the little bird again. And he paddled his kayak on and on. After a long time, he saw this really thin line in the horizon like a little piece of thread. And he thought it was land, so he paddled his kayak toward it. And this time, it did not disappear. It got thicker and thicker and thicker. And Kiviok landed his kayak way over on the other side of the ocean in a strange place. And when I was a little boy, and my grandmother told me that story, for the longest time, I didn't know the story had an ending because I always fell asleep.